What a day for Canada.
For as long as Canada had been turning up at World Cups, they had been leaving with the same souvenir. Nothing. No wins, no breakthrough. Just a few brave performances and a long, quiet drive home. So when the floodlights came up in Vancouver that Thursday night, with a sea of red packed into BC Place and the strange new weight of being a host nation pressing on every shoulder, this was supposed to be the night the curse finally cracked. And it did crack. The problem is, nobody walking into that stadium could have guessed how. Because by the time the dust settled, 2 Qatar players had been sent off. 1 Canadian had been carried away on a stretcher. Both benches had squared up on the halfway line. And a 6-goal demolition somehow ended up being the calmest thing that happened all night. They had come into this game already carrying a little frustration. Their opening match had ended in a draw with Bosnia, a result that felt like points dropped rather than points earned. And for a co-host with a packed stadium behind them, the margin for error was shrinking fast. Qatar, on the other side, were quietly dangerous. They had opened their own tournament with a creditable draw against Switzerland, and they arrived in Vancouver believing they could frustrate Canada, soak up the pressure, and steal something. For about 10 minutes, that plan looked completely alive. And then one decision turned the entire night on its head. It started with a Canadian breaking into the box and going down, and the referee pointing straight to the spot. A penalty. The home crowd was already on its feet, already celebrating, already imagining the lead. But the video review changed everything. The replays showed the contact had happened just outside the area, so the penalty was wiped away and downgraded to a free kick on the edge of the box. That alone would have been a gut punch for Canada, except it came with a twist that gutted Qatar instead, because the same passage of play left Qatar's Homam Ahmed shown a straight red card for denying a clear goal-scoring opportunity. So Canada lost their penalty, yes, but they walked away with something arguably far more valuable: a free kick in a dangerous spot, and a man advantage for the rest of the match. Qatar were down to 10, and there was still most of the game to play. You could feel the mood inside the stadium shift in an instant, from disappointment to something close to hunger, and one man smelled blood. Jonathan David had spent his career being the quiet, clinical finisher who made the difficult look routine, and on this night he turned a World Cup match into his personal stage. He struck once to settle the nerves and send BC Place into full voice. Then he struck again. And then, before the first half was even finished, he struck a third time. A hat trick. On the World Cup stage. For a country that had never even won a match at this tournament. To put that into perspective, no man representing the North and Central American region had scored a World Cup hat trick since 1930, when the tournament was brand new, and the sport looked nothing like it does today. David didn't just score goals that night. He pulled a piece of history off a shelf that had been gathering dust for nearly a century, and he became the first Canadian man ever to score more than once in a single World Cup game. The lead was commanding. The party was on. And then, in a single moment, the entire stadium went silent. It happened on a challenge that nobody saw coming. A Canadian player went into a duel, and Qatar's Asim Madibo came in on him, and the Canadian went straight to the ground. This was Ismail Kone, and almost instantly, the players around him stopped competing and started waving frantically toward the sideline, the universal signal that something is badly wrong. You did not need to be a doctor to read the body language. Kone first grabbed at his leg, then put his hands to his head, the gesture of a young man realizing in real time that his tournament might have just ended. The medical staff sprinted on. The crowd, which moments earlier had been roaring, fell into an uneasy hush. After the video review, the referee upgraded Madibo's foul to a red card, which meant Qatar had now lost 2 men in a single match and were down to 9. Madibo himself stood with his hands on his head, visibly shaken by what had unfolded in front of him. As Kone was lifted onto the stretcher and carried from the field, he found the strength to lift a hand and wave to the supporters, and the whole stadium rose to applaud him off. It was the kind of moment that cuts straight through the noise of a blowout and reminds you that underneath the spectacle, these are people, and sometimes the game takes something from them in the cruelest way. What happened next is the part nobody will forget. Nathan Saliba was the man sent on to replace the fallen Kone, and within a few minutes of stepping onto the pitch, he scored. A substitute, brought on in the worst possible circumstances, finding the back of the net almost immediately. And instead of celebrating for himself, Saliba reached for Kone's shirt, the number 8, and held it up to the crowd. A tribute, raw and immediate, to the teammate who had just been carried off in front of them. The stadium erupted. Because in that single gesture, the night stopped being about a scoreline and became about something a lot harder to put into words. Brotherhood, loyalty, the kind of moment that turns a football match into a story people tell for years. And the goals kept coming. A Qatar own goal added insult to a night that had already become a nightmare for them, pushing the score to 6. 6 goals to nothing. 9 men against 11. A hat-trick hero, a record nearly 100 years old, and a tribute that gave everyone chills. You would think that would be enough drama for one evening. It wasn't, because the real fireworks were still to come, and they arrived after the final whistle. When the match ended, the fighting didn't. According to multiple reports from inside the ground, a confrontation broke out on the halfway line between the two sets of players and staff, the kind of scuffle that turns the end of a football match into something that looks a lot more like a brawl. And it wasn't just the players. When the two managers met to shake hands, Canada's Jesse Marsch and Qatar's Julen Lopetegui, the exchange was anything but friendly. There were words, there was tension. 2 experienced coaches, one of them having just watched his side make history, the other having just watched his side fall apart and lose 2 players, meeting at the center of a pitch where the temperature was still rising. The handshake that is supposed to close out every match instead looked like it might reignite the whole thing. Afterward, Marsch tried to make sense of it all, and his account is worth listening to, because it paints a picture of a dressing room caught between triumph and shock. Marsch said his team was left shaken by what happened to Kone, and that losing him would be a huge blow for the squad. But he also revealed something that surprised a lot of people. According to Marsch, the Qatari player involved in the tackle actually came into the Canada dressing room afterward and apologized to Kone directly, and Kone let his teammates know that it had happened. Marsch said he didn't blame the player for the challenge itself, that he didn't believe there was any intent to cause that kind of injury. What he said he couldn't understand was the reaction from the opposing bench, the attempt, in his words, to turn a clear foul that had just broken a player's leg into an argument about whether the red card was deserved. Now, that is Marsch's version of events, his perspective on a chaotic night, and the other side will have their own. But it tells you everything about how heated things had become. When a manager whose team just won 6-0 walks out and spends his time talking, not about the goals, but about the bad blood. And underneath all of the chaos, 2 completely opposite futures were being written. For Canada, this was so much more than a single victory. It was the first World Cup win in the nation's history, and it pushed them towards something they had never reached before, a place in the knockout stages of a World Cup. Suddenly, a country that had spent every previous tournament as an afterthought was sitting near the top of its group, with goals to spare and momentum on its side. For Qatar, the picture could hardly be more different.